Welcome, everyone. My name is Tim Auger, and I am a product manager with Innovative Interfaces covering e-content and resource sharing products. Today, we're here to explore what is hopefully a fairly obvious question and answer, but is probably not, or yes, to answer, but is not so obvious to find the answer. Our presenters today represent a wide swath of the producer and consumer side chains of metadata and content. They are Rice Sanders, oh boy. I've made that mistake a few times in the last couple of weeks. Martha Rice Sanders, a good friend of ours. Rice Majors, Associate University Librarian for Collections and Scholarly Communication at Santa Clara University. Tim Coates, Library Advisor and Book Retailer. He's a consultant with Innovative Interfaces. Graham Bell, the Executive Director of Editor, and also Jeff Penka, the VP of Product at Zafira. So each presenters will, each of the presenters will further talk about their experiences with metadata and views on the importance of metadata and how it relates to the end user, or that is the consumer. So. Also, at the end, we will leave time for Q&A. And with that, I'll turn it over to Rice.
Oh, good. Oh, there we are. Thanks, Tim. I'm going to try to frame the problem or problems that libraries are trying to accomplish with metadata. And I'll just sidebar for a moment and say, so I grew up as a cataloger, and I often saw the problems that we had in terms of how we could solve things through better metadata, or how I could individually go into records and fix things and cause the library catalog to do different things. I then had a few years of my life that I was director of IT for the libraries at University of Colorado Boulder, and prior to that was at Innovative Interfaces for a few years. And I began to see things in terms of how we might be able to make the world a better place through solving how the catalog behaved on its own, so the kind of the IT or the software side of things. And I think it's really easy to see a lot of these problems through either of those lenses, and it depends on kind of where you're coming from, whether you might more organically see problems as solvable through better metadata or different metadata, or solvable through better library catalogs or discovery platforms, or et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of things out there now where our metadata lives. This stuff on this slide is coming a little bit out of some research that I did when I was at Colorado. So I did comparative usability of discovery platforms at that time, and I mined what we were using for libanswers at the time, which was a homegrown solution for us, the data that we had on questions that people actually asked at our reference desk. And tried to categorize those things. So this is not including where's the bathroom, where's the paper cutter, that kind of stuff, but things where we might expect a user to be able to provide self-service through the catalog if the catalog were perfect or substantially better than it is. So patron, and I'm not differentiating here between books and journal articles because in some cases patrons don't make that distinction. So patrons search for known items. They have a citation or whatever, something that feels like a citation that is accurate. There's a related task where they have an incomplete citation or a slightly wrong citation. So this got mentioned in class, or I heard about this on NPR, and I have a fuzzy knowledge of what it is that I'm looking for, but it is still an exact thing that I am looking for. And then there's searching and browsing by topic. So there's kind of two tiers of this. So there's the one where the paper is due in 36 hours, and there's the one where it is not, right? So graduate students and faculty largely fall into that latter category. Undergraduates move freely between those two categories depending on many other things like laundry. I'll just say, looking at these four things that patrons want to do, there's only one use case here where the patron only wants to see things that the library owns or has access to right this minute. And that is when the paper is due in 36 hours. The other three, the patron really wants what they want, and they're not as interested in whether the library owns it or whether they might have to reach out to consortial borrowing or rapid ILL or whatever. They want this stuff, and by default, I think most libraries are keeping folks in what I call inside the castle walls. So we preferentially show them what we own, what we have access to, and I think in a print world that made a whole lot of sense because that was a big difference between what we owned and what we didn't own. And that's eroding a little bit, and I think we're going to talk about that some today. There's a couple of other things that we use metadata for as a library, including call numbers, which are a flavor of metadata to me, because by assigning call numbers, we can then put things in call number order, and that arranges them into categories. So it's a kind of metadata, at least in my squirrely mind. But I'm going to focus more on the patrons for today and assume that libraries might be able to accomplish some of these other tasks in other ways if we got there. So where are we now? What do library catalogs do or do well right now? And I think this is a relatively obvious list because the things that it does well are, I think, right in front of us. So it reflects our inventory in terms of actual tangible materials that we own. Also inventory that's immediately accessible, so electronic resources that we've licensed or that we have on like a DDA program where it's completely opaque to the user that as they click on things, we might incur a rental charge or we might incur a purchase or an upgrade of an ebook, depending on what's going on, as well as some non-inventory in the sense that like open access things or things that are freely available on the web that we've chosen to include in the catalog. We also reflect inventory that's on order. I think most systems do this pretty well, often in pretty much real time as you place an order. You get something back from Gobi or Coots, and it's that on order status is reflected. Depending on your catalog and your library situation, you might also be able to reflect some other tangible materials that you can get from nearby libraries if you're in a consortium. So my last several employers, this has been true. We've been part of some consortium where we could reflect that we could get things from other libraries that were nearby. And this is something that we can do or can do well right now. So I have a companion list, which is my kind of like, hey, any ILS vendors who are in the room, Tim. So this is stuff that we either don't do or don't do well right now. So one is to reflect inventory that may become available. So there's, if you've published an article or a book that that it's coming out for a long time before it's actually available, but we know that this stuff is coming out. And in fact, I can often see in Amazon that a book is coming out long before I can see it in even the public library's catalog. And I sometimes see public libraries create kind of fake temporary records if they know that something's going to be really hot. So when new Harry Potter books were coming out, right, they would create a fake record so that people could place holds on it and then overlay it with an actual record when that became available. I actually think we don't do a great job of connecting users with interlibrary loan. So beyond these kind of consortial systems, I don't know, it's just like I myself placing interlibrary loan requests, it's a little clunky and it's a little detached from the catalog. You really want to get there. And it's something that as you move up in the scholarship ranks from undergraduate toward faculty, you get better at that and you accept those hurdles, which is not the same thing as it's easy to use. And I think certainly on the campus where I am now, that our stats reflect that. Our returnables through ILLiad are almost exclusively faculty and staff. We don't have a lot of graduate programs where I am, but undergraduates, it's just, they'll use it for articles, but they don't use it for returnables. I have returnables, that makes sense? Yeah, so things that, have to be returned. I don't think we do a great job of connecting users to the whole ecosystem of scholarship, and I think this is a big reason why people pivot to things like Google Scholar, because they want to know what's out there, and they figure that you'll get it for them. That happens to be true. That you would, in fact, get it for them. This is, I think, an area where we're not succeeding right now in terms of actually doing what users want to do, which is to let them explore this whole ecosystem of scholarship. It's getting, again, you can hear on this fourth point, you can tell that I'm a former cataloger. If there are errors in the metadata, and errors writ broad, right? So not just a typo in the title, but like this metadata is insufficient. Like it took me a long time to find this, and I would like to not have that happen again. There are a couple of interfaces that I know allow users to add tags or whatever, but it's retained in the local system only. It's really not great, and I don't know the solution here, but it's users find errors, and it's hard to report, hard to fix, etc. I think there's another thing where like sometimes users want to browse, and we have a fair amount of our collection still in OpenStax, and sometimes the best method, especially for an undergraduate, is to go to the call number area and browse. And you know, I mean, if I were sitting on the reference desk, sometimes I would say that, well, let's look up a few things and look at the call numbers and find patterns, and then go to that area of the stacks and browse. But again, why oughtn't the catalog say that? Like if I search for a topic, it ought to say, hey, or you could just go to this area of the stacks and browse, because here are the call number ranges where you're going to find that topic. And I'm not aware of any catalog that does this right now. I don't mean to be entirely in the past tense here. This is kind of where we're coming from, and some of these things I'm sure we still do believe. But this is kind of what have we believed. So one thing that we've believed, I think, is that we need consistency in metadata quality, and the argument being like, you know, if I do a search and I find some stuff, I may think that I have found all of the stuff that matches that search, and in fact, if you have inconsistent metadata, that might not be true. But at the same time, we actually live in this world right now. So I think every one of us has a library catalog where there's some records that are really pretty bad, by which I mean they were created maybe in an era where we were putting things on cards, and so being succinct was the real value. Yeah, I mean, the PCC and video cataloging is like its own nightmare, which many of you know. But just like the consistency in metadata is an existing problem that we live with. It's interesting to me that we believe that we need consistent metadata, and yet we have never had that. So I'll just sidebar there for a moment. We also have believed that we need high quality metadata, and again, this is like users can't find things if they're not well described, but we do have a lot of known item searching going on, where people are searching by title, or they're searching by author, or they have a citation and they do find things. And of course, at all of my last few employers, I've had thousands of records that are vendor supplied that, in fact, no cataloger would say that was a great record. And so, when do we need high quality metadata? When are we okay not having high quality metadata? And I think this is something that, on an existential level, some of us have been grappling with for a while. I think this last one is maybe a fading thing. This is more and more getting into just special collections and things like that. But I can remember a time when I did do a lot of enhancement of records. As I would download a record from OCLC or from Arlen, and I would personally enhance it quite a lot based on local guidelines. And I don't do that now. And then I think that another thing to reflect on is kind of this world that the patrons are living in, which is a world with some different assumptions maybe than we make in the library. So they've grown up, well, the 18-year-olds that I work with now don't know a time when they didn't have Google and Amazon. I mean, this is a really, they've always used these things. Google is trying to, and because of paywalls, Google can't quite do this, but Google is trying to connect users to the entire ecosystem of scholarship. They have a different kind of mission there that I think is interesting, that we don't share some of the aspects of that mission. And again, there's this idea of library systems trying to keep folks in the kingdom of what the library has bought and licensed. And this is even to the extent of, I would say, under-promoting ILL. If you search the catalog where I work, you really have to, not the consortial borrowing. The consortial borrowing is easy to find, but then to actually find, like, if no library in that consortium owns something, to find and use ILL is super non-intuitive. I mean, it's kind of hidden. So I'm guilty here too. Not me personally, I would change it. Google and Amazon do some semantic searching support. So if I search for Hillary Rodham, it will give me search results that include Hillary Clinton, and it won't say see also. Like, it just automatically offers me both of those, and it tells me that it did that, and I can always say, well, disinclude the Hillary Clinton stuff. I really am looking just for Hillary Rodham because of whatever I'm doing that I only want to, maybe I'm writing something on when she used what name, and I only want the Hillary Rodham stuff. But it's weird to me that the way that we use authority data and the way that Google and Amazon use their versions of authority data to suggest better searches. They're a little more heavy-handed, but they tell you that they did it. And I think this is something where we could go further. And then just like Google and Amazon don't get it right sometimes. And I iterate on searches sometimes. If it's not on the first page, I figure, okay, I need to search something else. And I don't think I do that because I'm a librarian. I think I do that because I'm a human who's been using Google for a while. And like you can tell, like, oh, did I type something wrong? Like whatever. If Google doesn't get it for me, I figure, I don't know. So I do iterate. I think everybody iterates if you don't find it. And so there's a certain amount of, like, I think we can reasonably expect that patrons will iterate a little bit. So where I would say, where's the near future where I would like to see us going, or where I think we should be going? And one is to view the catalog as part of this ecosystem, and not so much that we're trying to keep folks in the kingdom. Because again, like, I don't think there's anyone in the room who would say, no, I would not get that for you through ILL. Obviously, you want to promote the things that you bought, and you want to promote the things that you licensed, but I think not at the price of scholarship. It's kind of a weirdness to me that, yeah, especially like all of us have canceled some stuff that originally we thought was good, and therefore wouldn't we want to still connect people to those things if they were looking for them? I think this is hearkening toward something that I think we're going to hear in a few minutes, but I think we do need to allow for greater flow of metadata between systems. And this would include like metadata getting better, so letting better metadata flow in and overlay records kind of on an automated basis. Some of us have made some steps toward this, but I think the way that metadata flows right now is pretty clunky. And there's a lot of kind of human approval of things right now in a way that maybe is not as efficient as it could be. And I do think that library catalogs have a ways to go in terms of supporting semantic searching, so that if somebody searches Hillary Rodham or whatever, that you get something a little more, a little more in line with what patron expectations would be of other systems. And I don't know, maybe I'll be drawn and quartered after this, but I also think there's a certain amount of anonymity that we should allow patrons to give up. So maybe the catalog doesn't know that I'm Rice Majors, but it knows what I've been searching for, and it can recommend things based on other users. I would love it if when I went to the catalog it said, hey, this article has been published that really closely matches stuff that you've looked at in the past. And I don't know a lot of scholars that would be, I don't know, off-put by that at this point. Amazon is suggesting stuff to me every time I go there, and it's not just Amazon, obviously. United also has strong concepts of that I need to go to Charleston because it's November, because they're paying attention to me too, right? And yeah, I don't know that I don't know exactly how you would build that. You would build that. I don't know who here would build that, but you know, I understand where the privacy concerns came from initially, and if I got a diagnosis of something, and so I have a form of cancer, and I'm searching for that in the catalog, even in that circumstances, I don't want, you know, obviously, you know, the general world to know that I've got this diagnosis yet, but for it to suggest like, oh, well, users who searched this found these other books to be super helpful as well, might be actually a really good thing in the moment that I'm searching the catalog with that particular search. So I'll turn it over to Tim you're Tim number 1, right? You're Tim number 2? Thank you.
Thank you, Rice. I was warned not to fall off the back of the platform and disappear completely. I really want to make just one point, as simply as I can. I think it's fairly obvious, but to do what I'm going to suggest is quite difficult. You can see a lot of half my working life has been in retailing, academic retailing, and the other half has been in libraries, so I understand a little bit about how both worlds work. What retailers have had to learn in the last 20 years is that the single most important thing that they have to do is to deliver things fast. It is the single imperative in everything, and they've been forced to do that by the competition. In electronic material, it has to be instant. Otherwise, they're out of the market. And my belief is that in order for libraries to be able to do that, we have to work more closely with publishers and not in conflict with them. That's the lesson I learned in retailing. In retailing, you have a choice of working in conflict with publishers or working very closely with them. And the second is by far the more satisfactory and leads to the much greater success. That's the world that we live in. If we don't do that, we lose our audience. And if you don't know what losing an audience looks like, this is not relevant to you. It's a distant country and it's about public libraries. But that's the state of the English public library service at the moment. It won't last another 10 years. It won't last another 8 years. And that's because collectively they have denied that their job was to serve their audience. This is, I think, is a terribly important point. Particularly in the electronic world, you're not just looking for information about what you can, as a librarian, put into a collection. The real job that you're doing is finding the way to access the material that your readers, whether they be researchers or students or anybody, wants to put in their collection. It's the reader's collection that matters. Metadata, MARC records, my way of saying what they are is a way of describing in great detail, with great wisdom, what a book is and what it's about. But actually, metadata is also the way that the supply chain works. If you have the right metadata, pressing the right button will give you instant access to the material that you want. And Graham's going to talk about that. He is the world expert on metadata for supply chain for books. Really. One of the really important missing ingredients in the relationships between libraries and publishers, that most of the time publishers have no idea where their books are held, where they're circulated, where they're searched for and used, because that information doesn't get past the aggregator who has provided the library with the stock. We have to change that. We need to find a way that libraries can see where books are held and circulated, because otherwise they simply can't help you do the job that you're trying to do. We need a new way of communicating information about usage, particularly, backwards and forwards, between libraries and publishers. I'm not talking about personal information. I mean, and Rice has articulated the issues there very clearly, but I am talking about the sharing of performance information, usage information, not only with publishers, but also with their own customers, so that readers can see which books are used, which is obvious, but also with authors, and also with the people who fund libraries. It's a bit of an opaque world, what goes on. And the more information is put out and is open and shared, and where libraries can see with how other libraries perform, the better that in the end the service will be that we can give to the public, to the users. I believe that one of the keys in this is that a change need to be made, a major change in the way that we use library management systems, because they are the holders of the information about print data, print material. There's no reason why they shouldn't also be the holders of information about electronic material, and they can put it together. And we just don't use them like that at the moment. So I believe that we should. And Graham's coming on next. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim, for that rather fulsome and excessive description of me as a world expert. I'm nothing of the sort. But I am here to talk a little bit from the other side. I bring you greetings from the commercial supply chain. And first of all, a little bit about my organization, because I suspect in the audience, well, let's give you some exercise. A little pop quiz. Hold your hand up if you are a librarian. This is mostly for me. If you are a publisher, and if you are a vendor. Okay, thank you. And if you've heard of editor. Wow, actually, that's very surprising to me, and maybe changes something I'm going to say later. But first of all, we're a not-for-profit organization. We are based in the UK, and we're also very, very small. There's 4 or maybe 5 of us on a good day. I'll give you an idea of how small we are. If we all turn up for work on the same day, we don't actually have enough chairs. But we have a global membership of publishers, of retailers, of distributors, of wholesalers, of people who work somewhere in the commercial book supply chain. And by book supply chain, I mean book supply chain both for physical books and for e-books. And perhaps even more importantly, the supply chain for data. And the supply chain for data is not the same supply chain. It has a different shape, it has different participants and different intermediaries. Editor itself is best known for a standard called ONIX. It's not by any means the only standard we develop and promote. We also develop and promote Thema. We work on a system of messages called Editex and a few other things as well. An editor also supplies services to other standards bodies. So the International ISBN Agency is actually operated from within editor. The International ISNI Agency is also operated from within editor. But without doubt, we're best known for ONIX. And ONIX is as strong in the commercial book supply chain globally as something like MARC 21 is for libraries. It's used almost everywhere. Not by everybody, but certainly everywhere. We have ONIX members in North America. It's almost ubiquitous amongst mid and large size publishers. We have ONIX users in South America, throughout Europe, a few in Africa, not very many to be honest. Lots in Asia, including China, Japan, Korea, and so on. And I answered a query, a technical question this morning that came from a small bookshop in Trinidad. He's the only ONIX user in Trinidad, he tells me, and he asked a perfectly good question. So ONIX itself is an XML standard, or XML-based. It's highly structured. It contains the sort of data that you talk about all the time, bibliographic data. But it's not necessarily talked about in exactly the same terms, because for the most part, by bibliographic data, what publishers mean is product data. But it has all the same information in it as your MARC. And crucially for you, I think it has a few extra things as well. Now, things like title, author, ISBN, pub date, of course, the commercial supply chain relies on those in exactly the same way that you do. It also relies on subject coding and audience coding in exactly the same way, but it uses different schemes for recording the subject. Instead of Library of Congress subject headings or Dewey or UDC, publishers are bears of relatively little brain. They're certainly not trained to use something like UDC or Library of Congress subject headings. And so for the most part, in the commercial world and certainly in the trade publishing world, they'll use systems like BISAC or Thema or BIG. But the ONIX contains also marketing information. It contains descriptive text about books and reviews, a picture of the cover, extracts from chapter 3, a biography of the author. Also, sales rights. Can you get this book in your country? A MARC record tells you the book has been published. It doesn't necessarily say, can you get it in your country, because the publisher may not have the right to sell it to you. Crucially, of course, ONIX has pricing information. Pricing information can get incredibly complicated, both in ONIX and in the real world. I've been in a couple of sessions over the last 2 days where librarians were bemoaning lack of information in the MARC records that they had available to them about open access status and licensing information. Those two can routinely be put into ONIX by commercial publishers. Thousands of publishers all over the world are using this. By and large, most of them are able to use this data relatively well. But just remember, their motives are slightly different from yours. One of the things is that ONIX data is dynamic. Publishers start distributing ONIX data a good 6 months before publication. And of course, even the title, even occasionally the name of the author can change between that time and publication. And so the data format is subject to regular update. And it continues to get updated even after publication as well. Those reviews don't go in 3 months before publication. They go in, they get added to the data maybe a week, maybe a month or so afterwards. So post-publication updates continue. Publishers' motives for doing this are highly commercial. And I think you need to understand that. They don't have such a concern for authority control as librarians do. Just to illustrate how important good metadata is for publishers, we will try and show this graph. Now, this is from a study that Nielsen did. It's actually the UK study, but there's a US version of this study as well. The graph compares sales, average sales of all the books in the UK that sold more than 50 copies in, I think it's 2015 actually. The report was published in 2016. The darkest blue bars represent, of all of those books that sold more than 50 copies, those which had incomplete metadata. And the two lighter blue sets of bars represent those books where the metadata was deemed complete. Now, I'm not talking rocket science stuff here. We're talking actually only of perhaps the 11 or 12 most important metadata elements. And if you had all 11 or 12, you were in the paler blue bars. And if your book had maybe 1 or 2 of those missing, you're in the darker blue bars. Now, of course, the effect varies by genre or type of book. But you see, even for specialist nonfiction, there's about a 30% uplift in sales of books if the publisher delivers good metadata. They have a really strong commercial incentive to deliver good metadata to the market. And yet there's this schism between ONIX in the commercial world and MARC for libraries. And some of what's in ONIX might be useful on the other side of that chasm. It could be that things in the ONIX could be taken into your discovery layers, exposed to your users, giving them access to information that you don't have, whether it's open access, whether it's the licensing information, and so on. The link between ONIX and MARC is not necessarily simple. Syntax is completely different, but the semantics of it are not that different. And there's existing work about mapping from one to the other. I'd certainly recommend you take a look at the slides, take a look at the URL there, and read up a little about how relatively straightforward it is to map from Onyx to MARC and to make greater use in your discovery layers of the data that publishers are keen to give you. Thank you. I'll hand it over now to Jeff.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay. So Tim's going to be my time taker here. So we got 5 minutes. Okay. So I'm going to take a quick look at the question that we had originally, which was, are we done with metadata yet? And the answer is no, as evidenced by the fact the web's not done yet either. This is Tim Berners-Lee, and if you have been following him, he's actually on a movement again, going back to first principles on the web, saying it needs to be decentralized, not behind walled gardens. We live that world, right? He's saying if, for example, libraries put their content out there, the web should be able to use it. I'm going to tell you about an experiment he's doing where we have 1,500 libraries feeding directly into it. I want to use this because it's two things. I'm bringing lots of stuff with me. I've got tons of content. You could also view this as I've got a lot of baggage, right? One of our problems as an industry is that we too frequently say this statement. Yeah, that seems like a great idea, but what about? So we live by our edge cases. And that's one of our biggest challenges in becoming what I characterize as data native. So we have a great opportunity. Libraries led the web revolution. Many of us may not remember that. 20-some years ago, we were the people that helped this web start to happen. We got left behind. We left ourselves behind. We have an opportunity to reclaim that role in becoming data native. This means working with intention, using flexible frameworks, and understanding our primary and secondary use cases, but also understanding we don't get to control the ecosystem. It's important to understand what's your motivation or your perspective. You can be both a supplier and a consumer, and in this model, you've got both push and pull happening. But the precedent is being set by others. So if you were to go through this list, it's useful to understand, in the case of somebody like Netflix, they spend $150 million a year getting their recommendation algorithms tuned. 70% of what people see on Netflix is based on the recommendation, not something I went to look at. 35% of purchases on Amazon happen based on somebody actually buying something they didn't mean to. They didn't go there to buy it. Amazon is the largest known item search engine in the world, not Google. And what you're looking at here are suggestion engines, personalization engines, content creators, next gen, and artificial intelligence. It's helpful to understand. I understand that artificial intelligence has been one of the themes everyone's talking about. It's useful to understand this is a growing space that we want to participate in. We're not going to drive it, but we want to participate in it. Andrew Ng was the former chief scientist at Baidu and led their AI group. He's an adjunct at Stanford. I love this post he put out on Twitter. For AI to be free, we need not just open source, but also open data. And you can see, I love this comment. Perhaps, but arguably, the data is much harder and more expensive to collect than developing the algorithms to run against it. They're spending millions on the algorithms. We have the data and fulfillment that we can sit inside of it. That's one of our opportunities. But it's important to understand, what do we want to do? Do we want to be there? My guess is the answer is yes. If so, we have to understand what our assets are, and we have to make sure we're putting them into a format that they can be found, used, measured, and managed. So that's our opportunity. That's our core use case. Can we present ourselves in a way that others can actually use it? To become data native, shared vocabularies become key. So you'll hear about things like schema.org and BibFrame. All of these are just vocabularies in a modern framework for expressing data. You can be a part of all of them, not just one. But you're not going to be able to anticipate how it's going to be used, but you do know what it looks like not to show up. When we've talked to folks, and the team that I'm with at Zafira helped define the BibFrame framework, this is what we said about 4 years ago the adoption circle might look like. I'm sorry, the adoption curve. I would posit that we've moved our way down the curve from the semantic web to having a standard, to starting to test that standard, to building a network of connected individuals using these types of standards. The exciting thing is we've watched as our partners at places like Innovative, Circe Dynex, and other places out in the space have begun moving from the other end up, and we're coming close to meeting one another. And what does this actually look like pragmatically? With structured data like EAD, Dublin Core, MARC, any number of these things that are structured data, we're bringing them together, not as a pool of MARC data and a pool of Dublin Core, but a pool of library content that's connected. And we do that by taking that source data, transforming it and breaking it out of this concept of being a record, turning it into a reconcilable set of entities, and then we actually connect those across the participants, across the industry, across publishers, and then ultimately we make sure that we're participating in that bigger web conversation. So the goal is we don't sit and complain that somebody like Google, Wikipedia, or so on isn't paying attention to us. We understand that in order to participate in that conversation, we have to meet them where they're at. If you're hard to work with, they won't work with you. They don't hate you, but if you're hard to work with, you're hard to work with, right? What has this started to look like practically? We're moving from a place where in that visible web, one of the authoritative sources was Wikipedia, with about, at most recent measure, 20 to 50 gig worth of content. We're now publishing over 1,500 library systems with over 6 billion resources being published and woven into the broader web. And we've got about 100,000 gig or 100 terabytes of data that's being put out there and woven into those different systems. Each one of them comes with their own set of goals. So if you want to control everything, that only happens at the center, which is inside your universe. You can then advocate into a next circle, which might be within your community, your university, the different places you're working. But if you're part of the conversation, you're also going to hit that outer edge as well, which is that broader web. And you end up with opportunities presenting themselves. So the Internet Archive, for example, we sat down and met with the folks at archive.org and Brewster Kahle. During our meeting, he started to see the data that these libraries had been publishing. He jumped on Slack, which is a communications chat tool for his team. By the time we left the meeting, they had harvested all of the content and had started to build this screen. Before we got to the airport, he was done. And he said, it's so cool that libraries are becoming contemporary finally. If you don't know who Brewster Kahle is, he's sold 3 companies, the latest of which was Alexa Internet to Amazon. And he's helped create the web, and archive.org is what Brewster manages. He's excited to see you, at a minimum. So I'll leave you with that.
So unfortunately, we've run up against the clock, but I want to thank everyone, including our presenters here today. And if you do want to ask questions, we'll move over to the side here. And I know that, Rice, you have to run to your next session, but we'd welcome questions along the sides so that the other presenters can come up. Thank you so much for coming.